Hello. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. A couple of opening comments. Then I want to talk about the revolution in Rojava. I'm going to give you some of the history of that revolution and talk about the specific vision of the, I guess you could say, the founder of the most referenced PKK leader whose writings have had the most influence over the way that Rojava is organized, who's basically set down the pattern for the new society in Rojava. And then I'll try and talk a bit about how that system works, basically just to show you that the things that we've been talking about in this class are really happening and are really practicable. You know, whether or not the structure that they're attempting to put in place is followed through, whether or not that whole society is destroyed by Turkey or by Syria or by the United States or by Russia, which is quite possible. The fact that organizations like this occur proves their possibility, and that's one of the main things I'm shooting at. And then I'll finish up with some concluding comments about, what it was. What do I want you to take away from this course? So let me start. So let's talk about Rojava. One weird thing about Rojava is that nobody knows about Rojava. And this is, borderline conspiracy on the part of the media. It's because the media is determined in large measure in its content by corporate interests and by military and political interests. So much of mainstream news comes out of the White House press room and the Pentagon press room. There are regular relationships between big media and those providers of raw material for news. And this is Noam Chomsky's analysis. Chomsky, together with a guy named Edward Herman in the early 1980s, wrote a book called Manufacturing Consent, which is about using the mass media to manufacture common opinion. And he pointed out that because contemporary media production, mainstream media, like news production, is such a high volume enterprise, they have 24-hour coverage, right? Like, they need footage. They need things to report, and there aren't that many institutions which can provide that much footage. I mean, of course, they could just put like a whole shit ton of reporters all over the world, and that would be really cool. But they also have this sort of corporate model and an allegiance to their advertisers and so on, which makes that route undesirable. Because if people really start reporting, you start getting real pictures of how things are, and the way that things are is not particularly complementary to corporate ownership. So they prefer not to go that route. But another route that they can go is to hook themselves up with big institutions, military institution, the White House press room. But big corporations have, big PR departments. And the thing about these institutions is that they can be high volume providers of footage and of story. And they're doubly beneficial from a news perspective because there's an inbuilt veracity, like a truthiness. There's a truthiness about things that come out of the White House and that comes out of the Pentagon, which are useful in legitimizing stories that are being broadcast. And basically the point of saying all this is that news agencies, news outlets, therefore have relationships of obligation to the White House, the Pentagon. And so they can't really go opposed to the wishes of those institutions on anything like a regular basis, or hold out with stories that are not desirable to those entities, because then they're going to be cut off from the story flow. And you can see this sort of stuff happening with Trump. Because they have institutional relationships with these other institutions, they are it's partially obligated. There's sort of implicit agreements, and on the other hand, they're habituated to just talk about the things that they're supposed to talk about. And I think this is the reality of our educational system as well as of our media system, to leave these huge blind spots. Just certain things do not make it into the general space of media representation, and so to an extent it's like they don't exist. Rojava is one of those blind spots, and it's a blind spot because it's weird. Rojava is in a weird relationship with the rest of the world. It's surrounded on one side, at least until recently, it was surrounded by ISIS and people in Rojava, including women's militias, which are half of the militias, the YPJ, ISIS and al-Nusra on one side. And then they're blockaded by Turkey on the other side. Turkey hates them. I'll explain why in a moment. And then there's the Syrian regime and the Russians on another side. They have a working relationship with the United States and with United States special forces because they are fighting against ISIS and al-Nusra. And so they are probably technically a part of the Free Syrian Army. And they received, kind of support by American air power. And then recently they've been armed somewhat by the Americans. But at the same time, the Americans are allied in NATO with Turkey, even though Turkey is moving in a sort of radical Islamist direction. And Turkey hates Rojava because they come out of the PKK, which is the independence movement for Kurdish people, which from the Turkish perspective is deemed a terrorist group. And so the United States is also involved in an embargo to keep Rojava isolated. They're in a weird position. Anyway, so, okay, what's the history here? Just so you know what I'm talking about, Rojava is a set of 3, they call them cantons, areas, along the border between Turkey and Syria. So here's Syria, and of course there's this whole civil war going on in Syria. I think that has a lot to do with the large-scale power struggle between the United States and Russia, and also with instigations early on by the Americans who sought to cause an uprising because it would be beneficial for us if Syria were open to free markets. Anyway, so here's Turkey, here's Syria, here's the border. There's 3 cantons, 1, 2, 3. And I think 2 of them have now been territorially connected. So it's a significant piece of territory. It's not huge, but it's not nothing. And it is now being organized according to principles called democratic confederalism. This term comes from a leader by the name of Abdullah Öcalan. I'm guessing that I'm pronouncing his name right. I don't know. Who, in large part, derived the model from I guess they call him a libertarian anarchist theorist by the name of Murray Bookchin, contemporary anarchist theorist, who recommended these kind of systems. Like what we're basically seeing here is an autonomous and council-based system involving radical democracy, radical anti-patriarchy, radical ethnic inclusivity, anti-capitalist, anti-Western interventionist lines. Okay, so how does this all come about? Well, it comes about, first of all, so let me give you the history, and I'm basically just repeating the history that you can find in your text. If people do know about Rojava, and we're mostly prevented from knowing about it, but if people do know about it, what they're likely to know about is these militias, because one of them is an all-women's militia. Now, of course, it's not unprecedented for there to be women soldiers. The Mexican Revolution, there were tons of soldadas, I think that's the right thing, women soldiers. In the Spanish Civil War, there were tons of women soldiers. In the Bolshevik Revolution, women soldiers. In Israel, of course, lots of women soldiers. But in this case, there's an attempt for total equality between men and women, and there are all women's detachments. So how does all this stuff get started? Well, according to the text that we're looking at, it sort of gets started around 1978. So I imagine that you are somewhat aware, because of coverage of the Iraq War, that there is a region touching on Syria and Iraq and Turkey called Kurdistan, which is a traditional home place of Kurdish people. And the Kurds have been historically treated horribly by every one of those regimes. Those regimes, well, not Turkey, but both Syria and Iraq were part of Arab nationalism. This meant that, both those countries were state socialist regimes which achieved independence from colonial rule and tried to shore up their strength versus Western powers for a period of time until Iraq gets co-opted by the CIA and gets backed in the Iraq-Iran war, all that stuff. They set up state socialist regimes which nationalize the territory and the industry and the natural resources. Nominally, from the Marxist perspective, this is all great. If we really think critically, as we did when we talked about the Soviet Union with Trotsky, Of course, there are all kinds of problems that emerge here too, because control of land, resources, labor, consumption patterns, distribution of goods from Damascus, from a central location with a strong military-based government, isn't a whole hell of a lot different than having Exxon together with like some hired mercenary troops controlling a territory. In either case, it's a remote authority who controls the territory. And in these cases, the remote authorities were typically in Turkey pro-Turkish, anti-Kurdish, in Syria and in Iraq, typically pro-Arab and anti-Kurdish. These are different ethnic groups. Now, because of the Syrian civil war, there were already multiple ethnicities in the territory of Rojava. Syriac, Armenian, Arab, and Kurd, I think, are the four primary groups. But now there's this compression of diverse peoples there due to the wave of refugees. So this is on the way out of Syria. But then the Turks don't want people to come through there. So there's this backup of refugees. There's at least 500,000 refugees in Rojava, maybe more. Okay, anyway, so there's this long-standing historical oppression of Kurdish people and exploitation of them and their land for the benefit of these regimes. In 1978, the PKK is formed. And the PKK is the Organization for the Liberation of Kurdistan, an independence movement. And the way that our writers put it, in 1978 it looked like a leftist movement, and it was a Marxist-Leninist movement. Could succeed in Turkey. The left was pretty strong in Turkey. But then in 1980, there's a military coup in Turkey, the third one, I think they tell us. And this one, of course, is backed by the US and by the CIA. And you should just really be aware that this is what regularly happens. The US is involved all over the world. It's not just that we think we need to be the world's policemen and there's some kind of misguided morality going on here. There's a system of intervention by force for the benefit of capital. So this happens in Turkey, and in 1980, something like 650,000 people are arrested. Tons of people are put in jail. Tons of people are tortured. And this new US-backed military regime goes after the PKK, and they get pushed out of Turkey. Syria, however, had long been an adversary of Turkey. I suppose it's important when you think about, if you really want to think about possibilities of resistance and revolt and all this kind of stuff and systems of control, you have to realize that there are large-scale power dynamics anywhere that you go. The power dynamics in this situation involve Syria and Turkey. Turkey is a NATO member. Syria, until 1989, was an ally of the USSR. So the Cold War divide, like Rojava's on the Cold War divide. So Syria, though it itself was suppressing Kurds and treating them extremely harshly if they attempted to alter the regime's continual extraction of oil, agricultural product, and its determination of the way that agriculture is carried out. Any Kurds who tried to interfere with this were treated very harshly by the Syrian regime. So they were not really pro-Kurd. In fact, the way our writers put it, they treated the Kurdish territory in a quasi-colonial way. And I'll talk about how that is in a second. But they had an antagonism towards Turkey. And so if the PKK was going to direct its action towards the Turks and not towards Syria, then the Syrians were willing to harbor them and to allow training and bases on their territory as a lever to push against Turkey. And the PKK basically had to agree they wouldn't push against Syria. Now, why refer to the Kurdish situation under the Assad regime as quasi-colonial? I think there are two answers to that. One is the general way in which resources, labor, land, market was treated. And this is what capitalism does to the entire world. If it has a role in determining the usage of land, as the Assad regime here did, it typically is going to prefer monocropping over diverse agricultural production. Like, let's just have them make one thing. So in one of the cantons, maybe two of the cantons in Rojava, in this period of Syrian control, they've been constructed to just be producers of wheat. So that means that they're not producing goods that will satisfy the needs of the actual community. They're producing for a larger market, in this case, the general Syrian population. They're prevented from having processing, intermediary processing industrial facilities, which means, in this case, it was flour mills. So they're the breadbasket of Syria, but they've begun constructing them. They didn't have flour mills. So while they had all this raw material for making this very basic food item, bread, they didn't actually have the means to do it, because all that stuff, here's a typical quasi-colonial or neo-colonial arrangement. You set up monocropping because you want this area to produce for, when it's the capitalists who do it, it's produced for the international market. And so you can have famine locally, even though there's surplus going out. So monocropping for export, that's dimension number one. And same thing, there's a lot of oil in Rojava, which is one of the reasons that it's been able to survive, because now it is controlling, with the weakened Assad regime in the midst of this civil war. They have been able to take over their own resources in their own land and start reconstructing things, and even start building some intermediary industry, although this large-scale embargo enforced by NATO prevents this going very quickly. But they also have oil, and so they've been able to nationalize is not exactly the right word, because nationalize implies that we're talking about stewardship on the part of a state apparatus. They call it socialize or democratize. They've been able to take over the oil supplies for themselves, and even to begin refining it in a crude way, so they're able to produce their own energy source, and they also have a commodity for export. Were it not for their oil supplies, they probably couldn't exist. The other reason, though, that Rojava and Kurdistan in general can be referred to as quasi-colonial is that there was a program carried out by the Syrian regime in which they attempted to establish what they called the Arab Belt. So in the same way that in colonial territories in Kenya, the white settlers were, of course, given infinite privilege over the black Kenyans themselves, in Rojava, in Kurdistan, in Syria, the Arab people were actually brought into this portion of Syria and given privileges, given more land, given more access to industry, given more financial incentives, just preferred over the Kurds. So this is the second way in which the history of Rojava is quasi-colonial. Okay, so go back to 1980. The PKK sets up in Syria. By 1984, they're starting to carry out a guerrilla war versus Turkey. For what they want is independent Kurdistan. They want Kurds to be able to determine things for themselves. And of course, the Kurds have historically been treated terribly. I mean, think about Iraq, right? Like famously, Saddam Hussein gassed the Kurds. And then we promised the Kurds if they rose up, we were going to support them in the Gulf War. But then we just let the Iraqis squash them afterwards. They've been at the bottom of these societies for a long period of time. At this point, the guerrilla organization is a Marxist-Leninist organization, but then the Soviet bloc falls in 1989, 1990, and this leads to a sort of global rethinking, the kind of rethinking that I was saying was already starting in 1968, rethinking about statism in general. The idea that, a revolution needs to move towards the establishment of a special authoritative bloc, which is going to make decisions for everybody else, that a territory has to be administered vertically, that we have to make ourselves a nation, that we have to have a leadership, that there has to be an army, that this is statism. And this starts to get criticized within the PKK by the early 1990s. They start challenging many different things which had been sort of just folded into the revolutionary movements of the 60s and the 70s. For example, patriarchy. The kind of thing that you can unfortunately still see in the Black Panther Party was present in a whole bunch of different guerrilla movements too. Not all of them. I don't think this is necessarily true in Kenya or in Angola, but I don't know tons about it. But the PKK start doing intentional things to elevate women and to change patriarchal relationships as they had existed for a long period of time. So they form a women's militia, and this is sort of the predecessor to the women's militias in Rojava. But then by 1998, Turkey decides that they're no longer going to put up with Syria harboring terrorists. And let me come back to that in a second, this thing about terrorists. And so Turkey, so much of like this portion of the Middle East has to do with control of water supplies, right? I mean, the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict is sort of laid out geographically on the basis of water supplies and control over water supplies. The relationship between Lebanon and Israel has a whole lot to do with controlling water supplies. And this particular relationship between Turkey and Syria unfolded on the basis of leveraging of water supplies. So Turkey is controlling a certain amount of water going into Syria. They decide they're going to withhold that water unless Syria pushes the PKK out, disallows terrorist camps in Syria. And it works. The Syrian regime decides, okay, this is too costly to us. We don't have a real need to harbor enemies of our enemy if it's going to cost so much. And so they back off. And the PKK gets really weakened. And one of their primary leaders, Öcalan, in 1999, is abducted. And he's abducted, where is it? In Kenya, I think, at the Greek embassy or the Greek consulate in Nairobi, unless I made that up, by the CIA and the Mossad. These entities, you know, these intelligence organizations working together with large-scale militaries, of course, but also large-scale capital. This is what's really going on in the world, you know. And he's put in prison, and he's put in prison in a sort of like a romantic way. He's put on in an island prison, and he is the only occupant, and he's there for a decade or something. And he gets involved in this long study, and the long study produces eventually a new model for organization. So that model is the one that then comes to be employed in Rojava, and he calls it democratic confederalism. Let me back up. The thing about terrorism, you know, like this puts us in contact with Angela Davis, right? Is the PKK a terrorist organization? Now, I think on a naive view, we would think that there is a simple answer, right? The question is like, do they attack civilians? I don't know their history super well, but I do believe that they have engaged in asymmetrical warfare. So in this respect, yes, they're a terrorist organization, but they are also a military offshoot of an historically oppressed population who had been squashed by the Turks, as by the Syrians and by the Iraqis, with massive military force repeatedly through their history. So when you talk about people being terrorists, you tend to think like, oh, they just come out of nowhere. They've got some kind of crazy ideology. It's like driving them. Nobody can understand them. It's kind of like they're possessed. They're like devil people or whatever. The PKK is not like that. And this is the fact for most organizations that we refer to as terrorists. Now, it may well be that some of those organizations become profoundly violent and indiscriminate with respect to innocent people. But I bet if you look at any one of those things, if you look at ISIS, for example, it's an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is an offshoot of sort of the Taliban, and ultimately, you know, was constructed, well, whatever. It's not the best example. But most of the groups that become affiliates of Al-Qaeda, take Al-Shabaab, for example, in Somalia, they are organizations that started off as militant wings of popular movements demanding an end of oppression and the removal of foreign forces from a certain given territory. You want to get that argument, which I think is pretty convincing. Read Robert C. Pape's, what is it called, Dying to Win or something like that. What gets called a terrorist organization really depends on which are the powers in a position to define. And the power in this case in a position to define is the Turkish government in its alliance with the United States. Of course, the U.S. probably is playing around with these terms a lot because it is arming and supporting the YPG and the YPJ in Rojava. Those are some of the most effective fighters that they have in fighting against ISIS. And I mean, they couldn't be, you know, more different in terms of ideology. ISIS is a hierarchical, patriarchal, authoritarian, fascistic organization which engages in torture and mutilation and systematic violation of human rights and so forth, and otherwise identifies itself along some version of hyper-conservative Islamic caliphate rule. You know, so that's their thing. Everybody knows about them. And Rojava, they are the opposite of all that. They are racially and religiously inclusive. They are like explicitly anti-patriarchal. They are explicitly anti-authoritarian. They are explicitly anti-hierarchical. Okay, so but both these groups get called terrorists, right? The U.S. is probably playing games, sometimes calling the YPG and the YPJ terrorist in order to satisfy its NATO ally over here whose bases it needs and so on. And then other times not calling it that because, hey, we need somebody to fight ISIS down here because we have an interest in changing the balance of power in this region. We would like to back off the zone of Russian influence, and we would like to open up this previously state socialist territory to the markets. Of course, what's really happening is that the entirety of Syria is just being squashed. But of course, there are also other economic factors in the background of that, which is that, well, the more bombs that the U.S. drops, the more bombs that the U.S. has to buy from bomb makers back in the United States. The more use the United States puts its fighters and its communications network to, the more it has a need to update its communications network. That's sales. That's defense sales, right? And of course, there's all kinds of just looting of resources going on too by corporate powers as well as other powers. Anyway, so let's now shift over to Öcalan in prison on an island all by himself for a decade. So this is what he's able to do. He studies Marx, but he also starts to update his Marxist theory. So in addition to Marx, he reads Murray Bookchin, Immanuel Wallerstein, who's like a kind of radical historian, theorist, and Michel Foucault. These are all some of my favorite people. Bookchin I don't know that well, but I've started reading him because of Rojava. And he gets a model for government, largely out of Bookchin, which is basically a council system extended to include the economic dimension. And he also gets a whole story about the emergence of so-called civilization in the West. No, not in the West, in the whole world. Civilization, usually we talk about civilization as beginning, say, for example, in Mesopotamia, and then in China, and then a little bit later in Egypt. And when we talk about civilization, we mean like bigger cities. We mean centralized power bases. We mean royal, which historically were always paired with priestly hierarchies. These civilizations always occurred in valleys with plains around them. So they were established in places where grain production was easy. They tended to be based on monocropping. They were premised on the capacity of a central authority to sequester the surplus, a surplus production, and to hold it in the citadel. So the center of ancient civilizations involved a granary, and what made the rulership powerful was its control over the food supply for the entire civilization. Anyway, civilizations involve technological developments, the wheel, irrigation systems in particular. And we tend to be told the story that this is when humanity really starts, even though that's only about 6,000 years ago. And we've had the same anatomical being for 200,000 years. So the vast majority of the existence of people like us has been non-civilization, but still we are led to believe that civilization that's when it all starts. One of the reasons for that is that that's the point where record keeping starts. You want to read some really good stuff about this, stuff that I used to include in this class, and I think it's so good. Read this dude named James C. Scott. You can read Seeing Like a State, and then also read one of the ones I love, The Art of Not Being Governed. He's like a Yale political scientist guy. Really good stuff. Anarchist. We are always told that the development of civilization is forward motion, inevitable motion, progress, the real beginning of everything that we are. And then, of course, through history, there's always this juxtaposition of, hey, look, there's civilization and then there's the natives, right? There's the savages. And the savages can be the people in the Caribbean, it can be the people in North America, it can be African people, the people who are not organized in this hierarchical way, in this monocropped way, in this authoritarian way. And you can tell, I suppose, by the way that I'm talking about this, that maybe we could reevaluate whether this civilization thing is really good. And this is what Öcalan and Bookchin were doing. Oh, and by the way, did I say they got involved in a correspondence? So while in prison, Öcalan was able to converse with this theorist. And what Bookchin emphasized, and what Ukalan picks up, is that in the Paleolithic and the Neolithic periods, human society was not patriarchal. It was not necessarily hierarchical. It was communally based. It was certainly not individualistic as many societies become once we have the advent of Christianity and then the advent of capitalism. Communally based societies with a lot of respect for women, with locally based economies, an orientation towards the local territory which was relatively ecological, which did not destroy resources but nurtured them. And it's not that Ukalan or Bookchin want to go back to that. And Bookchin actually writes at length. There's a strand of anarchism called anarcho-primitivism, which says, like, look, civilization fucked up everything. Let's just go back. Of course, just going back, as most critics of that position say, there's this anarchist theorist named David Graeber, who's an anthropologist. He says, well, anarcho-primitivism would basically require that 99% of the Earth's population be destroyed. That doesn't seem like a very egalitarian solution. So Bookchin and Ukalan they're not oriented in that direction, but they do recognize that patriarchal society, hierarchical society, authoritarian society, monocropping, large-scale hierarchical structures are not the only way that humans can live. And that's proven. That's a proven fact because we have lived in other ways. And they both start rejecting the general story of progress that civilizations and regimes always tell, that educational systems always tell. But okay, first there was Mesopotamia, and then we had the Chinese, and we had the Egyptians, and in Chile there was a civilization was born, as if everything else were not human society, as if human capacities, potentialities, freedom and democracy were not already developed for tens of thousands of years before that. We're always told the story that that there's an inevitable direction to history. And although Marxism is so profoundly critical of hierarchy, of feudalism, of capitalism, it nevertheless subscribes to that story about progress. On Marx's model, you have to go through capitalism in order to get to communism. You have to have this period of rapid development of the industrial base, or else you're just going to live like a bunch of primitives. Like Marx still believed in the backwardness of primitives. And the whole Marxist tradition tends to believe in the inevitability of this whole progression. These are the things that these writers are really starting to question. They're like, well, maybe it didn't have to go like that. Maybe it's kind of contingent that it has gone like that. Maybe there is some amount of chance, accident, and free will or something that is involved here. And if that's the case, then maybe we could try to reverse a number of these things. Let's reverse patriarchy. Let's get rid of priestly power. Let's emphasize communalism over individualism. Let's allow power to devolve to the lowest levels, and let's make it stay there. These are the kinds of things that he starts thinking about. There's a parallel here to Rousseau in a way. Rousseau, who thought that there was a state of nature and people were better off in that state of nature, he was very vaguely referring to the Paleolithic and the Neolithic periods. And I think in that essay, in the Discourse on Inequality, Rousseau really believes that civilization has messed us up. It's made things worse. And this is quite possibly not just utopian idealism, but true. Maybe there are better ways to live. Maybe there are more natural ways to live. Ways of living which are less destructive to others, ways of living which move less in the direction of war, ways of living which sustain and respect women instead of attacking and disrespecting them, ways of living which preserve resources instead of infinitely exhausting them and polluting the environment in the process. If you drop that whole civilization is moving forward, progress is necessarily happening, we can't get out of it, globalization is our destiny. If you stop thinking in this basically religious way, because really I think the strongest background philosophical position for sustaining that attitude is the idea that, well, there's a God and God's got a plan. If you start backing that off, start thinking, well, okay, whether or not there's a God, I certainly don't know what his plan is. Maybe there's no particular course that things have to follow, or maybe it's our responsibility to make a course. If this is the case, then the kind of system that is set up in Rojava, that's basically the one that I want to go for. Although, if you check out a couple of these documentaries, you'll see it's not exactly clear that what's happening in Rojava could happen exactly elsewhere. There's certain things, they're stuck in the middle of a civil war, and they're stuck with an embargo, so their circumstances make things hard for them, but their circumstances have also made things possible for them. It is the fact that Syria was kind of a state socialist situation, and that the Assad regime, in the course of the civil war, its influence has been pushed out of the extremities of Syria and the border with Turkey. It's the fact that the state power backed off, which gave them access to a whole bunch of factories, pieces of land, especially land, and oil reserves that they could immediately democratize or socialize versus nationalize. It's because that previous structure was there that this is possible. This is way different than in our circumstance where everything is owned by corporations, right? And so in order for us to democratize and take over resources in this way, we would run immediately into private property and armed conflict on that point. But in general, the society that they're setting up seems really cool to me. Öcalan is in jail, and he's sharing these writings, and the people in Rojava start organizing on the basis of his writings. So they are establishing democratic confederalism. In 2012, the Syrian civil war starts, and this is the point at which they are able to take over these resources. Okay, now, what's the system that they're putting in place? First of all, I think we could call it a dual power system, meaning that they are not immediately attempting to destroy the Syrian state apparatus. They don't have the power to do that. They're not interested in doing that. They only want to fight Syrian state forces insofar as those forces prevent them from administering their own reality, administering and stewarding the resources, land, labor, and other institutions that surround them. Insofar as the state gets in the way, they're going to fight it. Otherwise, they're just going to let it sit in the background. And what they're going to try and do is build up a self-governing reality, the strength of which and the scope of which is ever growing, so that eventually, perhaps, the state could wither away. But the real emphasis, like with the Zapatistas, the real emphasis is on the growing of autonomous control and democratic autonomous control of these particular liberated territories. And what they put in place is a council system. But if you remember in Arendt, I think Arendt is a bourgeois theorist in the end. Because while she has a very high esteem for democracy, and thinks that democracy, like Rousseau, she thinks that democracy is the only form of government suitable to humans given that their nature involves free will. And she thinks, the full freedom of individuals does not consist in being allowed to do certain things. It's not negative freedom where certain obstacles are absent. It's positive freedom, meaning that we have to engage in a social decision-making process. And then she recommends the council system. And she says this shows up at all these different historical revolutionary points. But she'd been scared by totalitarianism. She'd been scared by the Nazis, and she had a very perceptive, critical eye for Soviet totalitarianism, even when a whole lot of people on the left wanted to believe that what was happening in Russia in the late 1940s was still really cool. That was a really heartbreaking story for the left and the rest of the world, because the Soviets had such success in taking over such massive territory and establishing such a powerful nation. People who wanted to overcome capitalism threw in their lot with the Soviets by and large in the 1930s and the 1940s. But then it just slowly dawned on people, oh shit, that system is ugly. Oh man, he's putting people in camps. Oh, it's totally authoritarian. It took the left decades to just admit what Stalinism had been. Hannah Arendt saw that right away. And the lesson that she derives from this, I don't think is the only one that you could derive. I don't think it's the right one to derive. The lesson she derived was that you shouldn't mess with economic conditions. If you mess with economic conditions, that's where totalitarianism begins. And that's probably a kind of like, right-wing conservative attitude today. You can have, politics is one thing, economics is another. But I think the more radical position, the Marxist position, the anarchist position in Rojava, is that no, you can't have any such thing as like real political decision making if there is not also a power of the locality, a power of the people over their economic conditions. Because if you can't control your economic conditions, you will be enslaved no matter what. So what is being built in Rojava is a council system which extends to control over the economy. So they have democratized the economy. There's a similarity also to Robespierre here. There's a specific guideline. So they have a kind of like a working constitution, which is referred to as a social contract. And some of the things specified there are that water, land, oil are human rights. So water, food, and energy are rights, and they have to be had for free. And they cannot be put on the market, because to put on the market, to open up to speculation and profiteering, and therefore to stockpiling, the exact question that Robespierre had dealt with had to be dealt with in Rojava. They had to figure out how to avoid stockpiling of subsistence foods, because this is what people will do. If you're an actor in an economic forum where if you hold on to things for a while, their value will go up. As they become more scarce, their value will go up. That's what rational actors in such an economic system are going to do. So they had to set it up so that those things are not allowed to enter onto the market. But once that stuff has been taken care of, luxury and surplus production can be sold on an open market. Now, it's hard for them to get to the open market because of the embargo. But the system that they've put in place on that level very much resembles that recommended by Robespierre. Okay, and then lastly, what's the whole system? Well, there's a council system, meaning that all kinds of different organizations and all kinds of different economic shops, cooperatives, each sends, each has a local council. Everybody involved in that endeavor is equally involved in making decisions which affect the endeavor. In fact, they have all kinds of rules put into place to guarantee ethnic and gender equality in these situations. So they have a minimum 40% women rule for any group, and especially for any leadership positions. And then they also have rules about including all the main minority groups, all the main religious groups. They intentionally nurture cultural traditions for all these different groups. They're trying to sustain the existing cultures instead of destroying them. The statist model tends to produce homogeneity. It tends to, think about Islamic people in France, for example. These debates about whether the veil is allowed. What French society wants and has wanted since the Glorious Revolution is the production of a French citizen. They want to make this one variety of person. That's what states do in general, and they do it in large part via their educational systems and now via their media systems. What the people in Rojava want to do is the exact opposite. They want to preserve diversity, nurture diversity, and through the nurturing of cultural diversity, perhaps to increase the degree of pluralistic democracy and the multiplicity of perspectives in decision making. So each organization, and you can read through these different organizations, the Union of Civil Society Associations, the Culture and Art Group, the Revolutionary Youth Movement, the self-defense groups, the YPG and the YPJ, the Association for the Family of Martyrs, the Human Rights Commission, and these are just some of the groups. They are democratically run by their membership, and then they send delegates to councils, to federal level councils. Those delegates can be recalled. They only have the right to report. They don't have the right to make decisions. And then all of the economic base is also council run and also sends delegates to the council system. So there are cooperatives, that is worker run businesses, worker run economic endeavors, the making of roads, the making available of energy, the running of presses, the running of sewing shops. You can read through all the examples of the things that they have cooperatized. All those co-ops also send delegates to the council. So you have this council system where everything is decided democratically in the most direct democratic way. And the goal, as was this is a valid, maybe the most central goal for Hannah Arendt too. The goal is to make politics a part of everyday life and to thus reverse the apathy that most of us feel politically and to put in its place a proactive, fuller, and more powerful relationship to my environment and an ever deepening web of social connection. So you've got all these, different people will be part of different groups. You can think back to say the Paris Commune during the French Revolution. You can be a member of a commune at the place where you live, but then you can also be a member of different popular societies. In Rojava, you might be part of a particular co-op that does cooking. But then you can also be a member of the youth movement or the youth group, which goes up to the late 20s. And then you can be a self-defense unit. And in taking part in each of these places, you take part in council. So you determine how you think that the conditions of your living should be altered, how you think that the practice of self-defense and the training for self-defense and the questions about who should you ally with? Do you trust the Americans? What are you going to do about the Russians? What's the relationship? What should we do with the Syrian forces? And what do you do with IS over there? And these decisions are made every day on all these different levels. And because there are all these different interpenetrating levels, this is one way in which the supremacy of any is forbidden. The councils determine what's going to happen economically. The councils determine what's going to happen militarily. Okay, so this is the society, and I'll leave it at that and let you go on and read it and check out the documentaries. The last thing I want to do before saying goodbye for the course is sort of scan over what I think the point of all this shit is. So, let me say, I know that you're not going to remember most of what went on here. You're not going to remember most of these texts. That's how it is for me. I don't remember most of my college classes. It's as if they never happened. I don't particularly care for the idea of, learning as memorization. I don't want you to do that. It's cool if you remember these things, but it's cool primarily because if you remember some of these things, that might cause you to have a different attitude towards your present. So everything is about the present, right? This class has been intended to allow you to recontextualize your present and not just to understand it as given, necessary, good. I don't want you to go on after this class just thinking the United States is the best damn place in the world, it's the best damn country in the world, we got the best damn healthcare system, we got the best, dealing with, we got the best economy, because that's all false, actually. First of all, I don't know what it means to talk about the best country in the world. Why do we even talk about that? But we do not have the best healthcare system. We do not have the best economic system. Stop saying shit that you're just told to say and that you don't think about, please. The sense of inevitability, the sense of it's just common sense that this is how it has to be, and you just have to get a job, and you just have to work in this stuff, and if you're a good person, you're going to succeed, and if you're not, you're not. I would like you to not accept those thoughtless ideological notions. And I think the primary way in which to achieve that goal is to show that the history that leads us to this point is a tragic one, but also that history shows different possibilities for life and for organization. And so does the study of comparative politics or comparative sociology. If you look at different places across the world, all of a sudden, our circumstance stops looking so natural and inevitable and starts looking somewhat arbitrary and changeable. And that's what I would like you to start thinking about. I also want you to be aware of the degree to which we participate in great big systems that could be called evil. I want you to think about that, and think about it especially when you go on right now to try and figure out what job you're going to do. I want strong minds, not submissive workers. I want free people ready for actual democracy. Let's fix this shit.